The New Hampshire legislative session ends in less than a month, but there are still dozens of bills waiting for a final vote, or a signature or veto from Governor Chris Sununu. It can take longer than you might think for the governor to evaluate a bill and decide whether or not to sign it. And as a Granite Stater, you always have the opportunity to share your opinion with him. So, this week we're going to talk about a bill making its way to the governor's desk. This is $100 Plus Mileage, the podcast about New Hampshire's unique legislative process. I'm Anna Brown from Citizens Count.
And I'm Mike Dunbar, also from Citizens Count. I'm glad we didn't miss the opportunity to talk about this bill because it's an area of law that's gaining a lot of ground. As more of our world moves online, more policy debates center around how businesses collect and use our personal data. The debate over gun laws is no exception. This year, the New Hampshire legislature passed a bill blocking credit card companies from implementing a code for firearm purchases. So let's get into that.
Okay, first we need to explain how these purchase codes work in the first place. Mike, talk me through it.
All right, here we go. So credit card companies use a merchant category code, that's abbreviated to MCC, to classify goods or services offered by a business. So this MCC can be used to calculate rewards or fees on different purchases. For example, if your credit card offers cash back on gas, your credit card company is going to reward you for purchases with MCC 5541, and that's the code for gas stations. Some cards may also restrict your purchases to certain MCCs. So, for example, a credit card designated for travel expenses might be limited to airlines, taxi cabs, and other similar categories.
How specific do these codes get?
Very specific. So, for example, there's a code for electric razor stores, a code for detective agencies, and even a code for wig shops. But until recently, there was no specific code for firearm retailers. They usually fell under MCC 5941, which is for sporting goods stores. However, in 2022, an international group that sets the MCC standards created a new code for firearm and ammunition retailers.
Okay, so now we're ready to talk policy. Gun control advocates lobbied for this firearm-specific code for several years. They argue this code could help identify suspicious firearm purchases. For example, in the 2 weeks before the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, mass murderer Omar Mateen used credit cards to buy almost $20,000 of firearms and ammunition, whereas his average spending before that was only $1,500 per month. Credit card companies may have been able to spot this unusual activity and report it to law enforcement before the attack.
Right now, the USA Patriot Act already requires financial institutions to report evidence of money laundering or possible funding for terrorist networks. So there's a precedent for private companies getting involved in law enforcement.
Sure. I mean, I also get, alerts of potential fraud when someone's buying something strange in another state with my credit card number. But gun right advocates counter that the new MCC will infringe on Second Amendment rights. They argue that since there are laws against a federal registry of gun owners, private credit card companies should not have access to data that could create a similar registry. The code also would not distinguish between firearm safety purchases, like a gun safe maybe, and actual firearms. So safety-conscious gun owners could be unfairly flagged for investigation.
Right, and plus there's just a general big brother sort of argument here. Other privacy advocates have cautioned against setting a precedent to surveil credit card purchases in general. In theory, for example, coming from the other side of the aisle, MCCs could be used in the future to track purchases related to abortion.
Yeah, I mean, when we were going through those codes, wigs and detective agencies are funny, but I can only imagine how specific it might get. So, since the announcement of the new firearms code, states including Texas and Florida have passed laws banning banks and businesses from using the code. California, however, recently passed a law requiring payment processors to use the code. While some members of Congress want the federal government to take a stand, for now it's up to individual states on whether to ban or require the MCC for firearms.
And that brings us to New Hampshire. So this year, 7 Republican representatives introduced a bill to ban the firearm code in New Hampshire, and that's HB 1186. Anna, you're the expert. Walk us through what this bill does.
HB 1186 specifically prohibits payment card networks and retailers from using a merchant code that is specific to firearms. So they're not saying specifically the MCC code, they're just saying you cannot code firearms in particular. If the Attorney General finds that a person or business is using a specific firearms code, that person or business would have 30 days to stop using the code and change their systems. However, if they keep using the firearms code, the Attorney General could take them to court. Notably, there are no criminal penalties in HB 1186, but the person or business could end up paying a civil penalty.
We already talked about some of the general pros and cons of these sorts of laws. I imagine similar arguments played out in the debate over this bill.
More or less, public safety, privacy, free markets, and gun rights all came up in public hearings. But supporters of the bill argue that New Hampshire needs this law in particular because our state constitution includes a right to privacy. I've seen that amendment come up in a lot of different legislative debates, but there hasn't been a really clear court case that I've found to define what exactly that right to privacy covers.
All right, so the House and Senate both passed HB 1186, so now it heads to the desk of Governor Sununu for a signature or a veto. If you have an opinion on this bill, reach out to the governor's office. There is a form to submit your opinion on his website at governor.nh.gov. Today, we talked about legislation that's getting debated all across the country, so let's bring it back home with our closing segment, Only in New Hampshire. Anna, what New Hampshire lore do you have for us today?
I want to do a throwback to the very first podcast episode you and I ever recorded back in 2021. We were talking about hobby distilling. Do you remember that one?
Ah, yes, it seems so long ago, the early days of this podcast. Yes, what do you have to tell us?
The legislature may have killed that attempt to legalize hobby distilling, but like many policy debates in New Hampshire, it came back. The New Hampshire House and Senate recently passed HB 1624, a bill identical to the 2021 proposal. It's on its way to Governor Sununu for a signature or veto. If he signs it, you will be able to distill up to 100 gallons of beer or wine into moonshine every year as a single person for your personal enjoyment. Higher limits, if you're a family, up to 200 gallons can be distilled. Full disclosure, a moonshine might have different ingredients than beer or wine. I am not a liquor expert. Also, please don't get into this unless you're really careful, because if I recall correctly, you can accidentally make methanol and blind yourself.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than making a beer in one of those big PVC containers, which is also very fun. I believe what happens is you make a basically a beer like a mash, and then you distill the alcohol out of that beer. So you kind of have to make a kind of beer in order to make moonshine or whiskey, whatever.
Not something I'm going to try for sure. But it definitely sounds like New Hampshire is very much sticking with its sort of, live free or die ethos.
Yes, exactly. Well, we remember, of course, I think it was around like 2015, there was the big craft beer surge in New Hampshire and elsewhere. Maybe there'll be a craft moonshine boom coming our way.
Economic Development 101.
Exactly. Right. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of $100 plus mileage, but you can find more information and episodes at citizenscount.org. This podcast is made possible by a generous grant from Northeast Delta Dental. We'd also like to thank Franklin Pierce University for producing and the Granite State News Collaborative for hosting. Our theme music is composed by me, Mike Dunbar, and lastly, we thank you for giving us a listen and thinking about how you can be part of what makes New Hampshire by the people, for the people.